The call came at 7 in the morning, while Nadia Calloway was still in her bathrobe, standing in front of the kitchen window with a cup of coffee she had not touched yet. She knew who it was before she looked at the screen. Her body knew first. That old tightening across her chest. That shallow breath that started and did not quite finish. The way a sentence stops mid-word when the speaker suddenly loses confidence. She let it ring. 3 times. 4. Then silence. She set the phone face down on the counter and drank her coffee cold, staring at the street below where ordinary people were already moving to ordinary jobs, none of them carrying the particular weight she carried every single morning she woke up in this city. Her name used to be Nadia Voss. She had gone back to Calloway, her mother's name, the name she was born with and had traded away at 26, for reasons she understood better now than she had then. On the first morning the divorce was finalized. The lawyer, a composed and efficient woman named Patricia Holt, had handed her the papers across a wide oak desk, and Nadia had signed them without reading every line, because she had already found the only line that mattered, and had committed it to memory. Dissolution of marriage. Those 3 words had cost her 4 years of trying to leave, 2 restraining orders that amounted to almost nothing in practice, 1 night in a hospital that she did not discuss with anyone, and a version of herself she was still, carefully, trying to reconstruct. Now she lived on the 4th floor of a building on Crane Street, in a city 400 miles north of the one she had shared with Marcus Voss for 7 years. She had chosen the distance the way you choose a destination on a map when you close your eyes and put your finger down and decide that wherever it lands is far enough. Far enough that running into him at a grocery store was not a calculation she had to perform. Far enough that the places they had been together did not inhabit the same air she now breathed. Close enough that she could transfer her position at Meridian Supply to the regional office, rather than starting over entirely at 34, with no savings worth speaking of, and a history she could not explain to a new employer without losing the job before it started. The apartment was plain. She had made it plain deliberately. No artwork on the walls, nothing ornamental that could be broken or missed. A bed she had bought, used and cleaned twice before sleeping in. A sofa. A small round table where she ate her meals alone and read paperbacks borrowed from the library around the corner on Friday afternoons. The library was her favorite place in this city, which she had lived in for 14 months and still thought of as the city rather than home, though she was working on that distinction. Nobody talked to you at the library unless you initiated it. Nobody required you to perform the particular role of being fine. She had been performing fine for a long time. 7 years of marriage had given her that skill. Among others, she would have preferred not to have. The ability to sit across from strangers at dinner and smile and answer questions, and give no indication whatsoever that the life being lived behind her own front door was operating according to its own set of rules, its own language, its own quiet taxonomy of consequences for getting things wrong. She had become good at the performance in the way that people become good at things they practice constantly under conditions where the alternative is worse. Marcus Voss was not a man who used physical force. She had learned to be precise about this when she described the marriage, because it was the kind of detail that caused people to tilt their heads and begin a sentence with, well, but if nothing actually, and she would stop them there, politely but completely, and explain that what he did was harder to name than a bruise, and harder to leave than a visible wound. He had taken things from her slowly, the way water takes stone over time, not violently, not obviously, but persistently, and without pause. He took her confidence first. This was easy, because she had always been a quiet person, a careful person, someone who thought before speaking and reconsidered after speaking, and he had a precise talent for reframing her natural caution as evidence of a fundamental insufficiency she carried inside herself. Her caution became indecision. Her thoughtfulness became slowness. Her preference for calm became proof that she lacked the instinct for anything larger. Then he took her friendships, and this was not forcible, which made it harder to explain to people later. He did it through small, repeated acts of inconvenience, arriving late to collect her from gatherings so that she spent the last portion of every evening watching the door, forgetting to relay her messages, being so precisely cold and correct in the days following any event where she had enjoyed herself without him that she found it easier, eventually, to stop making plans that depended on his cooperation. Her friends, who were not unkind people, drifted in the way that friends drift when you keep canceling, and keep apologizing, and keep promising next time, while clearly not being able to guarantee it. By the 3rd year of the marriage, she had acquaintances instead of friends. People who would stop and say hello and not call. By the 5th year, She understood that this had been the intended result. She left for the first time on a Tuesday in October. She packed a single bag while Marcus was at work, moving through the apartment with a purposeful silence she had been rehearsing in her mind for months. And she drove to her sister Carol's house in the town 40 minutes away and sat on Carol's sofa and said almost nothing for the first 2 days. Just the physical relief of being in a room where nothing was required of her. She lasted 6 days before Marcus appeared on Carol's doorstep with flowers and something in his face that looked so thoroughly like grief that Carol, who was a generous person and had only ever known the public version of Marcus, believed it without hesitation. He was sorry. He knew he had not been easy. He wanted to do better. He wanted her to come home. He said home as though it were a neutral word, a place you might choose to return to, as though home was something other than what it had been. Carol said gently that perhaps she should hear him out. Carol meant this kindly. Nadia went back. She left again 14 months later. A women's shelter this time, a place with a keypad door and counselors who conducted their sessions without visible judgment and asked questions she had not known she needed to be asked. She lasted 9 days before the guilt arrived, that specific, practiced guilt of a person who has been told, consistently and patiently over enough years, that the difficulties in someone else's life are a consequence of their own failures. She had been told this so many times, in so many quiet and reasonable ways, that the belief had stopped feeling like something someone else had installed and started feeling like something she had always known about herself. She went back. The third time she left, she called Patricia Holt first. She had been setting aside money for 11 months by then, small amounts drawn from her own salary into an account Marcus did not know about, $50 here, $30 there, moved carefully and without pattern. Patricia heard her story in a single 2-hour meeting and laid out the process clearly, without drama and without the particular kind of pity that Nadia had come to dread, because pity confirmed that the situation was as bad as she feared. Patricia treated it as solvable. She treated Nadia as capable of solving it. Those two things were, at that point, among the most useful things anyone had offered her. The divorce took 14 months. Marcus contested every element, not because the contested elements held value for him, but because the process itself was leverage, and leverage was the currency he understood most fluently. He called her throughout those 14 months, not daily, because daily would have been documentable. Enough. He sent emails that were pleasant and reasonable in isolation, the kind you could present to a judge, and have the judge say, "I see nothing here." He appeared once at a coffee shop where she was meeting Carol, took a table nearby, ordered something, read a newspaper, and left without looking at her once. She had spent the following hour unable to stop shaking, and had nothing she could bring to anyone's attention. Patricia filed the final papers. The court signed them. Nadia Calloway drove 400 miles in a borrowed car with everything she owned in the back seat, and took the apartment on Crane Street, and lay on the bare floor of the empty rooms that first night. Not crying, not celebrating, just breathing. Just breathing in a room that belonged only to her, where the specific quality of the silence was the quality she chose, rather than the quality she had been assigned. She had forgotten that that distinction existed. She had spent 7 years living in his silence, and had forgotten that silence was something you could also choose. The job at Meridian Supply suited her. She coordinated deliveries and invoices and client schedules for a regional network of restaurants and hotels. Precision work, which she had always been good at, and which had the particular comfort of problems that had correct solutions discoverable by patient method. She liked her colleagues without being close to them, which was a configuration she had settled into and was not entirely sure she could move out of yet. She took her lunch breaks at the same sandwich place 2 blocks from the office, ordered the same thing, sat at the same table in the corner. She had become, without quite deciding to, a woman who took up the minimum necessary space. She chose seats near exits in public places. She chose the table against the wall over the table by the window. She noted, automatically and without effort, the faces of men who entered rooms she was already in, and she registered which of them were approximately Marcus's height and build, and she tracked what they did with their hands. She did not think of this as fear. She had learned to think of it as information management. It was the same thing, but the reframing helped her function. Marcus had called that morning at 7. She had blocked the number. 17 now, in 14 months. He always found new ones. She pulled on her coat, picked up her bag, and walked to the bus stop in the flat morning light. She got on when the bus arrived, took a seat by the window, and watched the city move past the glass, indifferent, and ongoing, and hers, as much as any city can belong to a person who is still in the process of learning to inhabit their own life again. She told herself, as she told herself every morning on that bus, what she had been telling herself since the night she lay on the bare floor of her empty apartment. She was still here. He had not changed that. Not today. Not yet. She got off at the Meridian stop, badged through the lobby door, and walked to her desk. 14 emails. She opened the first one and began, and for the next few hours she was simply a person doing her work in a clean, lit office, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, and which she had learned to recognize, quietly, as a gift. She had no idea what was already in motion. She had no idea that a man named Enzo Carrera existed, or that he would soon become relevant to her life in a way she would never be able to trace or confirm or fully understand, only experience as a change in the weather, the abrupt and total cessation of something that had been falling on her for years. Her name appeared on the delivery sheet on a Wednesday morning, third item from the top, beside a notation that read, Donati's Restaurant, Private Dining Suite, corrected invoice, signature required before noon. It was not an unusual task. She had made 3 similar runs to client locations in the past month, when the delivery team was short-staffed, dropping paperwork, collecting signatures, being in and out before anyone needed anything more from her. She took the sealed envelope from the front desk administrator, a cheerful man named Phil who always thanked her for taking the extra runs, and signed out one of the company pool cars, a gray hatchback with a slight rattle in the passenger door that she had learned to ignore. The drive across the city took 20 minutes. She found a parking space on the street outside the restaurant and sat in it for a moment before getting out, not for any particular reason, just the residual habit of gathering herself before entering a space. She had developed that habit in the marriage, the pausing at thresholds, the brief inventory of her own face and posture, checking that everything was arranged in the correct configuration. She was aware that she still did it. She was working on stopping. Donati's was the kind of establishment that communicated its nature from the exterior without announcing it. Dark stone facing, heavy brass fittings on the main entrance, no menu displayed in the window, because the clientele it was designed for knew what they were arriving for, and anyone who did not already know was not the intended audience. Nadia had delivered to the kitchen entrance twice before, brief visits, efficient, always in and out through the side door without seeing much of the interior. Today she was directed to the main entrance, which was slightly different but not concerning. The correction had come from the billing department, probably an amount error on a previous delivery. Simple. The hostess at the front desk was a young woman named Lily, who recognized her from the previous visits. She smiled and gestured toward the hallway. Private dining. Last door on the left. Mr. Donati said to go straight back. She said it without any particular emphasis, the way people give directions to familiar routes. Nadia thanked her and walked down the corridor, which was lined in dark wood paneling and carpeted in deep forest green, and smelled of something cooking slowly and well, stock and herbs, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that has been running since early morning. She reached the last door on the left, knocked twice in the standard professional way, and opened it. The room had 6 people in it. 5 men seated at a long dining table set with papers rather than plates, and a 6th standing near the far wall with his arms folded. The seated men had the look of a meeting that had been in progress for some time, jackets off in some cases, papers spread across the table surface, coffee cups at various stages of completion. The standing man was younger than the others, and was watching the door when she entered. She understood within the first 2 seconds that she had walked into something she was not meant to encounter. Not because anything alarming happened, not because anyone moved toward her or spoke sharply, but because of the quality of the silence that fell into the room when she appeared, the particular shape of it, the way it had weight and direction, the way every face in the room oriented toward her with a specific and immediate attention. 4 of the 5 seated men looked at her with an identical expression, flat, measuring, the look of people who make rapid threat assessments as a matter of professional habit, and whose default is a kind of suspended judgment that is not hostile but is not welcoming either. It was the look of men who deal regularly with variables that have not been accounted for in the original plan. The 5th man, sitting at the head of the table, looked at her differently. He did not look alarmed. He did not look annoyed by the interruption or immediately calculating how to remove the complication she represented. He simply looked at her with the full and steady attention of someone who is used to understanding things quickly, and who sees no reason to rush the process or perform it for an audience. He was completely still, in the way that very confident people are still. Not frozen, not tense, but settled, as though the chair he occupied were exactly where he intended to be, and nothing about the situation, including her sudden appearance, had changed that. She noticed, in the automatic way she noticed things about rooms, that the weight of authority in this one sat entirely with that man. The younger man near the wall took a step forward. One of the seated men stood up. He was large in the particular way of people trained for physical situations, and his stillness when he was not moving had its own kind of presence. "This is a private meeting," he said. His voice was measured and controlled, the voice of someone who has learned not to let volume do work that precision can do better. She held up the envelope. "Invoice delivery from Meridian Supply. I just need a signature." Her own voice came out level and clear, which surprised some part of her, the part that still expected her body to react visibly to uncomfortable rooms. She had learned, in the years of the marriage, to keep her voice steady in situations where steadiness was difficult. She would have preferred to have learned it some other way. The man at the head of the table raised 2 fingers from the surface of the table. Not a gesture exactly. Barely a movement. 2 fingers lifted perhaps half an inch, held for a moment, lowered again. The standing man sat back down immediately, without comment, without looking at the man who had signaled him. The younger man near the wall relaxed his posture and returned to his original position. The adjustment happened so quickly and so completely that it took Nadia a moment to process what she had just observed. The entire room had responded to the smallest possible action from one person, without any of them appearing to think about it. That was not, in her experience, how rooms full of men in expensive suits typically operated. The man at the head of the table stood. He was older than she had initially registered, late 50s, perhaps 60, with silver at his temples, and a quality in his face that she found difficult to name precisely. It was not hardness, exactly, though hardness was part of it. It was more like the face of someone who has been required, by the specific circumstances of their life, to make accurate assessments of a very large number of situations and people over a very long time, and who has arrived, through that process, at some private understanding of the world that does not need to be explained or defended because it is simply known. His suit was dark and fit him with the ease of long habit rather than recent effort. He crossed the room toward her without hurrying. Everything he did had that quality of unhurry, not slowness, not indifference, but the absence of unnecessary motion. She held out the envelope and her pen. He took both. He opened the envelope with care, not the casual tear and glance of someone who expects nothing interesting and intends to sign quickly and return to more important things, but with actual attention, actually reading the invoice before he did anything else. She watched him scan the document. His expression did not change. He signed at the bottom in a small, neat signature and handed both back to her. "Thank you," she said. He said nothing. He held her gaze for a beat that lasted perhaps a second longer than the exchange required, and she was not sure what to make of that, and she was not sure he intended her to make anything of it. And then she turned and walked back down the green corridor, and through the lobby past Lily, who smiled again, and out through the main entrance into the gray mid-morning air. She stood on the pavement for a moment. The envelope was in her hand. The signature was correct. She tucked it under her arm and walked back to the gray hatchback and drove to the Meridian office and returned the car key and went back to her desk and opened her emails and did not think about the man with silver hair again for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, her life continued in its established pattern. Work, the sandwich place for lunch, the walk along the river path on the evenings when the weather stayed mild, the library on Saturday, groceries on Sunday morning, before the aisles got crowded. Marcus called twice, using numbers she had never seen before. She blocked both of them. 18 now. She updated her log. She had been keeping the log since Patricia Holt had first advised it, over 3 years ago. Not a journal in the emotional sense, not a record of how she felt about what was happening, because she had learned that tracking her feelings about his behavior was a kind of trap, something that kept the focus on her interior landscape rather than on the documentable facts. The log was only facts, dates, times, numbers. The content of voicemails, transcribed exactly. The nature of any contact she could verify. It was, Patricia had said, the kind of documentation that sometimes made a difference in court, and always made a difference in your own capacity to maintain clarity about what was actually happening, as opposed to what you were sometimes tempted to believe was happening. Nadia had maintained it faithfully. She kept it in a password-protected file on her laptop and backed it up to a small drive she locked in her desk drawer at the office, in the way that someone keeps a document they hope they will never need to produce but cannot afford not to have. The call log told a clear story. The frequency had not dropped significantly. He was not moving on. He was maintaining contact through rotating numbers at the rate of 2 to 3 contacts per week, which was exactly the rate that kept him present in her life, without being documentable as a campaign. It was, she had come to understand, a deliberate frequency, not enough to constitute harassment in the strict legal sense, enough to ensure she never forgot he was there. She was thinking about that on the Tuesday morning, when she saw her name on the delivery sheet again. Donati's restaurant, private dining suite. No, this time it was the kitchen entrance. Replacement glassware delivery. Units arrived with incorrect specifications, needed to be returned and replaced. A logistics errand, nothing that required paperwork or signatures from anyone above kitchen management level. She signed out the gray hatchback, loaded the box from the stockroom, and drove back across the city. The side lot adjacent to Donati's was small, 6 or 7 spaces, a low brick wall along the near edge, the restaurant's kitchen delivery entrance at the far end. She parked and cut the engine and reached into the back seat for the box, which was bulky but not heavy. She pushed the door open with her hip, stepped out into the cool air, and turned toward the kitchen entrance. Marcus was standing at the entrance to the lot. She saw him before he registered her. 2 seconds, maybe 3, and in those 2 seconds her body did what it had been trained to do without her permission. Her shoulders came in, her chin dropped slightly. Her weight shifted in the particular way of a person making themselves harder to reach. The posture of a woman who had spent years learning to reduce her own surface area in his presence. Then his eyes found her, and his face settled. That specific settling she knew better than she knew almost anything. The slight easing of an expression into something that looked like patience but was not patience. The face of someone who has arrived exactly where they intended to be and sees no reason to conceal that. He walked toward her at his usual pace, which was never fast. Fast would have suggested urgency, and Marcus had never been a man who allowed himself to appear urgent. He moved the way he moved through every situation, deliberately, without excess, as though time were a thing he had an adequate supply of and saw no need to spend carelessly. Nadia, he said. Just her name. The way someone says a name when the name is a complete sentence, when it contains everything they intend to communicate before they begin communicating it. She stopped. The box was in her arms. She did not answer. She had learned in the years since leaving that silence was sometimes the only response that did not give him anything to work with. He looked at her with something that might, to a stranger, have resembled warmth. "You look tired," he said. This was how he began things, not with accusations, never with accusations in the first sentence, with an observation that was actually the opening of a door into an argument about her state, her capacity, her fundamental adequacy. "This city, I thought you'd go further, honestly. You always say you're going to do the thing, and then you find the comfortable version of it." He said it without cruelty in his voice. He had never needed cruelty in his voice. The content was sufficient. She took one step toward the kitchen door. He shifted, not in front of her, never in front of her, but slightly, in a way that made the path socially complicated to use, without explicitly pushing past him. He had spent years perfecting that specific repositioning, the movement that could not be documented because it had not technically blocked anything. "I know you've been keeping records," he said. He did not know. She was certain of that in the part of herself she still trusted. It was a guess offered in the language of certainty, because that was his method, to make you uncertain about what he knew and what he didn't, so that you never felt secure in the documentation you were building. You file things, you write things down, you think it helps, and maybe it makes you feel better. But nobody's paying attention, Nadia. Nobody cares. You packed a bag, you drove a long way, you changed your name back. A small pause, almost fond, which, by the way, nobody who matters will ever use. You can write things in files all you want. At the end of it, you're alone. You're standing in a parking lot with a box in your arms and there's nobody here. No one is going to save you. That's simply the reality of your situation, and I think you've known it for a long time. He said it in the voice he used for facts. Not raised, not heated. The voice of someone reading a weather report, stating conditions as they are. Then he put his hands in his pockets and walked away, through the entrance of the lot, and back toward wherever he had left his car, at his usual unhurried pace, as though this had been nothing more than a brief and pleasant interaction with an old acquaintance. She stood there. The box was in her arms. The kitchen door was 30 feet away. She stood there, and she breathed, and she made her feet move, one at a time, toward the door. She was still doing that. That was what she did. She made her feet move. She did not see the 3 men standing at the far end of the lot, near the wall by the street entrance. She was not looking in that direction. She was looking at the kitchen door and concentrating on reaching it. She did not see the man who stood at the edge of the lot with 2 associates, who had arrived 7 minutes before she pulled in, who had been looking at something on his phone, and who had looked up when Marcus Voss's voice began carrying in the still morning air, and who had not looked back down again. She delivered the glassware to the kitchen manager, a brisk and capable woman named Rita, who thanked her and handed her a receipt to sign. She signed it. She said goodbye to Rita and the 2 prep cooks who were working at the far counter. She walked back to the hatchback and got in and closed the door and sat behind the wheel. 4 minutes. She sat there for 4 minutes before she started the engine. Then she drove. At the far end of the lot, Enzo Carrera watched the gray hatchback pull out into the street. He stood where he was for a moment after it disappeared. Then he went through the kitchen entrance the same way the woman had gone, found Paul Donati in the corridor near the dry storage room, and asked him 4 words. "Who is that woman?" Paul told him her name, her employer, and the fact that she always thanked his staff, which in 22 years of knowing Enzo Carrera was the kind of detail he had learned to include when Enzo asked about a person, because Enzo had always paid attention to how people treated the people they had no reason to impress. Enzo thanked him and left. He did not explain himself. He rarely needed to. Paul Donati had been running that restaurant since he was 30 years old. He was 61 now, and in 31 years of operation he had developed a set of instincts that had kept him functional in a world that required him to navigate relationships with people whose interests were not always simple and whose expectations were not always stated. One of those instincts was a precise understanding of which questions to ask and which to let pass without inquiry. When Enzo Carrera asked him for information about the woman from the supply company, Paul provided what he knew, completely and without embellishment. Her name was Nadia Calloway. She worked for Meridian Supply. She had been making deliveries to the restaurant for approximately 8 months, and she was unfailingly polite and specifically thanked whichever member of his kitchen staff was nearest to her when she completed a delivery, by their first name, which she appeared to remember from previous visits. Enzo thanked him. Paul did not ask why. In the car, Gordon, a contained and perceptive man who had worked alongside Enzo for 11 years through a range of situations, some of which had required the kind of discretion that does not have a professional category, waited until they were 4 blocks from the restaurant and turning onto the main avenue before he spoke. "The man in the lot," Gordon said, the one who was talking to her. "I know what you're going to say," Enzo said. He was looking out the window, watching the city move past. "Yes. You want information on him." "Everything," quietly. Gordon nodded once and did not ask anything further. In 11 years he had learned that Enzo's reasons existed before they were stated, that they were always sufficient when they became visible, and that pressing for their early appearance was a form of impatience that Enzo did not share and did not particularly admire. The file arrived at Enzo's office the following morning at 8:15, which was when Gordon preferred to deliver things that needed to be reviewed before the working day was fully underway. Enzo read it at his desk with a cup of coffee and no distractions. Marcus Voss, 41 years of age, financial consulting, mid-sized firm, respectable client list, no irregularities of record, home address in a comfortable residential neighborhood, gray European sedan, regular schedule, Monday through Friday, predictable hours, occasional travel, no criminal record, no civil judgments, no public legal history of any kind. That last item did not surprise Enzo. He set the file down on his desk and looked at it for a moment without reading it further. Men like Marcus Voss almost never had records. Records required either recklessness or visibility, and the particular kind of person that Enzo had identified in that parking lot in the span of 30 seconds was neither. He was careful. He was consistent. He operated within the margin of what could be proven, and the margin had been calculated precisely. Enzo understood calculation. He had spent his adult life among people who made their decisions through it. He knew what it looked like from the outside, and he knew what it felt like from the inside, and he knew that the absence of a record was not the absence of a history. It was simply the successful management of one. He sat at his desk in the quiet office with the file in front of him and thought for a while. His office was a plain room, a desk, chairs, bookshelves, a window overlooking the financial district street below. He had never needed his environment to announce anything about him. Environments that announced things were for people who were not confident that the announcement was being received through other channels. He thought about his mother. He did not do this often, and he was aware that when he did, it was rarely arbitrary. She was 78 years old and still lived in the house where he had grown up, in a city 6 hours north, a house that was too large for one person and that she refused to leave because, she said, she had spent enough of her life being moved from one place to another by other people's decisions, and she intended to remain where she was until she chose otherwise. He found this completely reasonable. He thought he had always found it reasonable, even when he was a child, even before he had the language for what he understood about the situation. His father had been a particular kind of man. He had been charming in the way that some people are charming, easily, naturally, without apparent effort, in a way that made you feel chosen when the charm was directed at you. In public, he was warm and amusing, and the kind of person that dinner tables organized themselves around. At home, he had been something quieter and more specific. Not violent. Enzo's father had never used his hands, and this was the detail his father had used when Enzo was old enough to confront him about it as the primary evidence of his own restraint. But he had used language the way a more direct man might have used force, as a means of establishing and maintaining a hierarchy in which his position was always unquestioned, and the cost of questioning it was made clear through other means, through the withdrawal of warmth, through the particular patience of a man who knows he does not need to escalate, because escalation would only reduce his options, and he has sufficient options in the tools already available to him. Enzo had been 9 years old when he first understood the shape of this, clearly enough to name it to himself. He had not had the adult vocabulary for it then. He had simply understood that the house he lived in had 2 temperatures, and that the cold one was the dangerous one, and that the shift between them was controlled entirely by one person, and could not be predicted or influenced by anyone else. He had been 22 when he stood in the kitchen of that house and placed himself between his father and his mother and said, in a voice that had no heat in it, because heat would have made the conversation negotiable, "This is finished." His father had looked at him for a long time, a very long time. Then he had put his hands in his pockets and walked out of the kitchen and had not repeated the behavior. Enzo had never known with certainty whether the change was the result of fear or recognition, whether his father had been frightened of what Enzo had become by that point, or whether something in him had been reached by the act of being seen clearly, by someone who would not look away, and had finally registered. He had decided, eventually, that it did not matter. The outcome was the same. His mother had the rest of her life in a house with a different temperature. He was not comparing his mother to Nadia Calloway. He did not know Nadia Calloway. He had observed her for approximately 4 minutes across 2 separate encounters, and he had heard a conversation in a parking lot that had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. He was not in the business of projecting his personal history onto strangers, but he knew the architecture. He had grown up inside it. He knew the specific way a person holds themselves when moving carefully through the world has become their primary strategy for getting through a day, the slight reduction of surface area, the attention to exits, the very particular quality of stillness that is not peace but the controlled management of fear. He recognized it the way you recognize a smell from early childhood, immediately, completely, in the body before the mind. In that parking lot, a man had stood in front of a woman carrying a box and told her, in a reasonable and measured voice, that she was fundamentally alone, and that no one was going to intervene on her behalf. He had said it as though it were a law of nature, as though it were simply a condition of her existence that he was helpfully clarifying. Enzo had the means to demonstrate that the law was not a law. He picked up his phone and called Dennis Hale. Dennis was a careful man in his late 50s, who had trained as a lawyer and spent his career operating in the space between the strictly legal and the genuinely practical. He was not an employee of Enzo's and had never been, which was a distinction that mattered in the contexts where he was useful. He was an intermediary in the precise sense of the word. He moved between situations and resolved them by finding the exact point at which a problem could be addressed without generating a larger one in its place. He had worked with Enzo on 4 separate matters over the past 12 years. Each had concluded without escalation and without residue. He was reliable in the way that a very good lock is reliable. It does the thing it is supposed to do, completely, and then you stop thinking about it. Enzo laid out the situation plainly. He gave Dennis the name, the address, the employer, and the schedule. He described what he needed communicated and the precise parameters of the communication. He was specific because he was always specific, and because in this case, specificity was also the message. The nature of the information being delivered would itself convey that the parties involved had access to information, which was the primary point. No threats, no reference to physical consequences of any kind, no language that could be characterized as coercive under any legal standard. An intermediary meeting in a professional setting in which a certain fact was communicated, that a certain pattern of behavior had come to the attention of certain parties who were now fully aware of it, and that the cessation of that behavior was the only advisable path forward. The woman herself, Dennis said when Enzo finished. He always asked the relevant questions, and he asked them without judgment. Does she know you're involved? No. Is she intended to know? No. End of week. Yes. The call ended. Enzo put the phone down and returned to the papers on his desk, which were considerable and required his full attention. He gave them his full attention for the remainder of the afternoon, and did not think further about Marcus Voss or Nadia Calloway, or the parking lot on the side of Donati's restaurant. He was not doing this because he thought of himself as a protector of strangers. He did not have a romantic conception of himself or of his motivations. He had heard a man state a falsehood as a permanent fact, and he had the means to correct the record. The correction would cost him the expenditure of a favor and Dennis's modest fee. The cost was negligible. The available action was clear. It would have seemed wasteful, almost irresponsible, to do nothing simply because the situation did not directly involve his interests. Dennis Hale arrived at Marcus Voss's office building on a Thursday morning. He had arranged access through his professional credentials, presenting himself as a business contact referred by a mutual connection, vague enough to be difficult to verify quickly, specific enough to produce a meeting. He was shown to a 6th-floor conference room. Marcus arrived 2 minutes later. He was neat and pressed and carried himself with the ease of a man who is accustomed to being the most composed person in a room and has never had serious reason to doubt this assessment. He sat down across from Dennis with an expression of mild, polite expectation. Dennis placed a thin folder on the table between them and did not open it. He looked at Marcus with the expression of a person for whom the current moment was neither dramatic nor difficult. I represent certain interests, Dennis said, who have become aware of your ongoing conduct toward Nadia Calloway, he continued before Marcus could respond. The telephone contact, the appearances near her residence, the encounter at Donati's restaurant last Tuesday morning. He allowed each specific detail to land before moving past it. The specificity was the message. It said, "We know the particular things, not the general situation." It said, "We have been paying attention for a specific period of time." It said, "You do not know how long or to what depth." The pleasantness in Marcus's expression did not disappear but changed quality, became something more careful, more inward. "The interests I represent are not law enforcement," Dennis continued. "They are not connected to any legal proceeding involving yourself or Miss Calloway, past or ongoing. They have no interest in your professional life or any aspect of your personal arrangements beyond this single matter." A measured pause. "They have one interest, that your contact with Nadia Calloway ends, permanently, completely, with no exceptions." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at the folder on the table between them. He looked at Dennis. He was, Nadia had always said, a very intelligent man, and Enzo had taken that at face value when he considered how to approach the matter. Intelligent men ran calculations. The calculation Marcus needed to arrive at was a simple one. The dimensions of what he was dealing with, weighed against any conceivable benefit of continuing. The folder was a prop. Dennis had included nothing in it, but a man looking at a folder that has been placed on a table between himself and a stranger who knows specific details of his movements makes his own inference about what the folder might contain. That inference was the point. "Who are you representing?" Marcus said. His voice was level. He was working to keep it level. Dennis could always tell when a voice was being maintained rather than natural. "I'm the person who came to speak with you this morning," Dennis said. "That's the relevant information. And if I choose to disregard this conversation, Dennis folded his hands on the table and looked at Marcus with the steady and impersonal attention of a man explaining a sign that has been posted and cannot be removed. "That would be a choice," he said. "I would encourage you to consider, carefully, whether it is the choice you would like to make." He stood up. He picked up the folder. He looked at Marcus one final time, the way you look at something that has been noted, and that you do not intend to spend any further energy thinking about. "Good morning, Mr. Voss." He left. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Marcus sat in the conference room for 18 minutes. His phone was on the table in front of him, and he did not touch it. He ran the calculation. He ran it again. He was thorough, because thoroughness was what had kept him safe for a long time, but thoroughness in this case returned the same result each time he arrived at the final column. He could not see the edges of what he was dealing with. He could not estimate its scale or its reach, or what it had already documented. The specific details had been too specific for inference. The meeting had been arranged too cleanly for bluster. The man across the table had been too calm for performance. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He walked back to his office and sat at his desk and looked at his phone. He did not call Nadia. He sat at his desk for a while longer, and then he returned to his work, because returning to his work was what a composed man did, and he was, above most other things, committed to his composure. He did not call her the next day either, or the day after that. The week ended, and another began, and Marcus Voss did not call. Nadia checked her log every morning as she always did, and every morning the previous day's column was empty. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she had believed in temporary before, and been wrong. She blocked 2 more numbers that called once and did not leave messages, and then did not call again, numbers she could not be certain were his, but which her body responded to with the old response before she even looked at the screen. She blocked them anyway. She updated the log. 20 numbers now. 20 entry points into a life she had built specifically to exclude him, one by one sealed. She did not call Carol about the silence. She was not ready to describe it to anyone yet, because describing it would require forming a belief about it, and she was not ready to form a belief about it. She had been wrong about silence before. She had celebrated silence before and been wrong. She let the days accumulate and watched them accumulate, and said nothing about it to anyone, and went to work, and went to the library, and walked by the river when the weather permitted, and existed in the space that was hers, waiting to see what the silence meant. She would not know for a long time. She might never know fully, but the days kept coming, and they kept being quiet, and quietly, underneath everything, she began to believe in a different kind of not yet. She did not reach for that belief easily. She had tried it before and it had cost her. But the weeks kept adding up in the log column under the heading of no contact. And each week the column remained empty was another week that became part of the record. And records were things she trusted more than feelings. The record said 12 days, then 18, then 25, then a full month. She watched the number grow the way you watch a number you need to be large enough grow, with attention and without pressing it, the way you do not press a thing you are afraid of disturbing. It held. 2 full weeks passed before Nadia Calloway allowed herself to notice the silence properly. She had lived with the calls as a regular and expected feature of her life for long enough that their absence felt less like relief and more like a perceptual problem, a kind of ambient dissonance, the way a room feels strange after a noise that has been present for months suddenly ceases. You keep bracing for the sound. Your nervous system keeps preparing the response. The preparation becomes almost indistinguishable from the threat itself. She caught herself checking her call log every morning the way you check a wound, not because you expect it to be better, but because not checking feels reckless. She mentioned none of this to Carol. Carol called on Sunday afternoons as she always did, and Nadia answered, and they talked about Carol's job, which was teaching secondary school history, and involved a level of daily chaos that Carol narrated with the amused exasperation of someone who has been surprised by a situation they chose and cannot quite believe they keep choosing. They talked about Carol's husband Owen, who was building a raised bed in the garden in what Carol described as an extremely elaborate manner for the production of what would ultimately be a small number of tomatoes. They talked about a film they had both seen separately and had slightly different responses to. They did not talk about Marcus. This was not because Nadia was hiding the silence from Carol. It was because she had not yet decided what to say about it, and she had learned that saying something before she knew what to say about it was how she ended up having conversations she was not ready to have. Carol would want to believe the silence was permanent. Carol would want to celebrate it. Carol needed things to be better for Nadia in a way that was entirely loving and that sometimes made it harder for Nadia to speak accurately about what was actually happening, because accuracy was not what Carol needed in those moments, and Nadia did not always have the energy to manage both the truth and her sister's response to the truth. So she let the Sunday calls be about tomatoes and films, and she said she was well, which was more true than it had been in some time, and she hung up and sat in her quiet apartment and listened to the quiet and tried to determine whether it was a different quality of quiet than the last time the calls had paused. It was. She was fairly sure it was. It had a different weight to it, a different texture, something she could not name except by comparing it to previous silences, which had all had a particular quality of suspension, the quiet of something held rather than the quiet of something released. This felt like release, or like what she imagined release would feel like. She had not experienced enough of it to be entirely certain what it felt like. The third week of silence arrived and passed. She stopped checking the call log every morning. She moved to every other morning, and then to 3 times a week, and then to twice, and then once, on Sunday evenings as a kind of review of the week gone past. She held the phone and scrolled the missed calls and found nothing from numbers she did not recognize, and she put the phone down and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite hope but was related to both, something that existed in the cautious and specific region between them. She started going to Harbor Coffee every morning instead of every few days. It was a small place 3 blocks from Crane Street. No menu on a chalkboard, no seasonal drink specials, no piped music designed to create an atmosphere of productive calm, just a counter and a handful of tables and a woman named Bet, who made excellent tea and knew the name of every regular within 2 visits. Bet had known Nadia's order since the 3rd time she came in. Black tea, 1 sugar, and she never looked at the pastry case but sometimes allowed herself to be talked into the shortbread. And they had developed the particular kind of easy acquaintance that grows between a person and a counter they visit frequently. They talked about small things, the weather, the renovation 3 doors down that had been in progress for longer than anyone could explain, a book Nadia mentioned once and that Bet had read over the following weekend and come back on Monday with opinions about. These conversations lasted 3 or 4 minutes and were, Nadia had found, more stabilizing than they had any right to be. She was sitting at the table by the window one morning, 6 weeks after the parking lot at Donati's, before she noticed that she had been sitting at the table by the window for 5 days in a row. She sat with this observation for a moment. The table by the window was the table she had avoided since moving to Crane Street. She had sat at the corner table, the one against the back wall, the one you chose when you wanted to see the room without being visible from the street. The window table meant your back was to the glass. It meant you could not see who was on the street without turning. It was the table a person sat at when they were not arranging their environment around the management of potential threats. She was sitting at it. She was facing the room. She was watching the morning move through Harbor Coffee, Bet behind the counter, a man in a green jacket reading something on his tablet, 2 women talking near the door, the ordinary continuous traffic of people who had nowhere urgent to be at this hour and were choosing to be here, and she was not calculating any of it. She was simply watching. She finished her tea. She thanked Bet. She walked to the bus stop and got on the bus and went to work. In the office, a notice had gone up on the internal announcement board. The regional coordinator position was open for applications. Nadia looked at it for a moment at lunch, standing at the board with her sandwich in her hand, reading the requirements. She met all of them. She had met all of them for over a year. She had not applied the previous time the position was open, 14 months ago, and the time before that. She had told herself it was timing, circumstances. She was still settling in. She knew, honestly, that the real reason was that she had spent 7 years being told she did not perform well under pressure, that her judgment in high-stakes situations was not reliable, that the instincts she trusted were the wrong instincts for the wrong reasons. She finished her sandwich at her desk. She downloaded the application form. She stared at it for a while. She closed the tab and opened her emails and worked through them, and then opened the application form again at 4 in the afternoon and filled it out section by section, carefully and without excessive thought, the way she filled out documents when she was trying not to let the part of her that second-guessed everything get involved before she had committed to something. She submitted it at 4:47 in the afternoon. She shut down her computer, put on her coat, and took the bus home. In her apartment she made dinner, pasta, simple, something she did not need to concentrate on, and ate it at the kitchen table with the window open. Afterwards, she washed her dishes and made a cup of tea and sat on the sofa with her book and read until she was ready to sleep. She did not tell anyone she had applied. She wanted to hold it for a while without anyone else's response being part of it. She received a call from her department head 2 days later. Karen was a direct woman who did not use more words than situations required, which Nadia had always found refreshing. "Your application came across well," Karen said. "The selection is straightforward, honestly. Your numbers are the strongest in the regional team and your client retention is consistent. We're going to move you up. I want to start the transition next month. Can you do that?" It was not entirely a question. Nadia said yes. She sat at her desk for a moment after the call ended. She was aware of something moving in her. Not euphoria, not triumph. Something quieter. Something that had to do with the recognition that the story Marcus had told her about herself had turned out to be the wrong story. He had told it so consistently and with such apparent certainty that she had internalized significant portions of it, and those internalized portions had been difficult to identify and even more difficult to dispute because they sounded, from the inside, like her own thoughts about herself. That was the precise mechanism of the thing he had done, making his assessment of her indistinguishable, for long enough, from her own. She updated her log that evening. She did not write about Marcus. She wrote the date and the words, "Regional Coordinator." Then she closed the file and put the laptop away. She did not know, sitting at her kitchen table in the quiet apartment on Crane Street, what had happened in a conference room on a Thursday morning 6 weeks earlier. She did not know the name Dennis Hale, or what he had said to a man across a table in an expensive office building, or what that man had calculated in the 18 minutes he sat alone afterward, or what conclusion the calculation had produced. She did not know any of the mechanics of the silence. She knew only the silence itself. She was learning to trust it. Not completely, not yet, but more each week. She was learning to hold it without bracing against it. The window table at Harbor Coffee, the application form submitted without excessive deliberation. The job she had been qualified for and had now received. These were not dramatic victories. They were not the stuff of any kind of narrative anyone would tell about transformation. They were small, quiet, consecutive things. The kind of things that add up over time into a person who is larger than they were before. Not visibly, but in the way that matters. In the interior architecture of what they believe themselves capable of. She had built them, one at a time, from whatever was available. That was the part no one would ever see. Not Gordon, who confirmed the silence in a 3-word report to a man who nodded and moved on. Not Dennis Hale, who had already moved on to other matters. Not Enzo Carrera, who was sitting in his plain office 4 miles away, doing what he always did, which was exactly what the day required of him and nothing more. None of them would ever see her sitting at the window table on a Tuesday morning, choosing it, choosing to face the room, choosing to stop measuring the distance to the exit. She chose it anyway. She went back the next morning and chose it again, and the morning after that. She did not stop. That was the whole of it, and it was not a small thing. The whole architecture of what Marcus had built around her had been constructed on the assumption that she would stop, that she would run out of the particular resource, stamina, belief, the willingness to keep going in the absence of clear evidence that going was worth it, that was required to outlast him. He had made his assessment of her capacity in the early years of the marriage, and had built everything that followed on it. The assessment had been wrong. She had not known it was wrong at the time. She had required the distance and the time, and the specific particular mercy of a quiet phone to discover it. But she had discovered it. Somewhere in the city, she did not know where, a man named Marcus Voss was living with the arithmetic of a situation he had misjudged, and the arithmetic was telling him something he had not previously had to calculate. That some situations exceeded the available tools. That some walls were too solid to move with the instruments he had spent years sharpening. He was not, she suspected, a man who would entirely believe this for very long. He was not a man who accepted limitations with grace. But the calculation had held for 6 weeks, and then 8, and then 12, and at some point a calculation that continues to return the same result becomes a different kind of fact than a calculation you are still running. She did not think about him often, less and less. This was itself a kind of progress, not the dramatic kind, not the kind you could describe to someone and have them understand immediately what it cost to arrive there, but the ordinary accumulated kind that happens when you go enough consecutive days without the emergency, and your body slowly lowers the readiness it has been maintaining at significant internal cost. The library on Saturday, the groceries on Sunday morning, the window table at Harbor Coffee on weekday mornings. These were her coordinates. They did not sound like much. They were everything. Carol called one Sunday and said, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, that Nadia sounded different. Good different, Carol added immediately. Not nervous different, settled different. She said it tentatively, like someone offering a thing that might break if handled without care. Is that real, or am I making it up? I think it's real, Nadia said. And then, because Carol deserved the honest version even when it was imprecise, I'm not sure what changed, but something did. Carol was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. That's good, and left it there, which was, Nadia thought, the right thing to do. She worked her first full month as regional coordinator in the autumn, when the mornings had turned cool, and the Riverwalk was lit by low gold light in the late afternoon that made the city look like a photograph of itself. She was good at the work. Karen had been right. The transition was straightforward. The job was larger than her previous one and suited her in the way that work suits a person when they have been operating below their own capacity for a significant period, and the adjustment feels less like effort and more like relief. She called Carol on the Sunday after her first full month and told her about the promotion, which she had not mentioned before. Carol made a sound that was somewhere between celebration and reproach. Why didn't you tell me when you applied? I didn't want to think about it too much, Nadia said. Fair, Carol said. And then, with the directness that was her best quality, you did that yourself, you know. That one's entirely yours. Nadia sat with that for a moment. I know, she said. She said it quietly, to herself as much as to Carol, and she meant it. She had done it herself. She had filled out the form and submitted it, and answered the questions honestly, and received the result, because she had done those things, and because Karen had assessed them accurately, and given her a role she had earned. Nobody had given that to her. Nobody had arranged it on her behalf, or cleared the way for it, or intervened in her capacity to pursue it. She had needed the silence to be able to pursue it. The silence had come from somewhere she would never fully trace, but the pursuit had been hers. That distinction mattered to her. She spent some time with it, turned it over, examined it from the angles available to her. The pursuit was hers. The silence had been a condition of the pursuit, and she did not know who to thank for it, and she might never know, and she had decided to be at peace with not knowing, to hold the gratitude without an address for it, which was an unusual thing to hold but not an impossible one. It sat with her comfortably after a while. It sat with her the way that the best kind of gift sits with you, not as something you owe, but as something you received, and now carry forward. She was going to be all right, not in the large, final, certain way that the sentence usually implies, because she had learned to be suspicious of large, final, certain things. In the particular, provisional, daily way that she had come to understand was the actual form that being all right took, for most people, most of the time. You were all right today. You were all right this morning. You were all right in this specific moment, sitting at this specific table, with this specific cup of tea. She was all right this morning. She would find out about tomorrow when tomorrow arrived, which was the only responsible approach to tomorrow she had ever discovered, and which felt, after everything, like the most honest arrangement with the future she had ever made. She finished her tea and went to work. Enzo Carrera learned that Marcus Voss had made no further contact with Nadia Calloway, because Gordon confirmed it on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after Dennis Hale's meeting in the 6th-floor conference room. Gordon mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, briefly, factually, without editorial comment, and Enzo received it with a single nod. The matter was filed and, in the way that Enzo filed most completed matters, closed without ceremony. He did not think about it again for some time. There was no shortage of other things to think about. His days were full in the way that the days of a man who has spent decades building and maintaining something complex are always full, with decisions that have real consequences, with people who require attention of different kinds, with the ongoing work of operating in a world whose terms he had not chosen but had accepted and navigated with considerable skill. He was not unhappy, he was occupied, which was the state he had always found most natural, and the line between occupied and content was one he did not spend much time examining. He called his mother on a Sunday evening, as he did most Sunday evenings. She was well, Her garden had produced a good amount of late-season vegetables that she was distributing to neighbors with what she described as aggressive generosity. She was reading a biography she found alternately fascinating and deeply annoying. The weather in the north had been unexpectedly mild. 10 minutes into the call, she said, "You sound like something settled." He said he was the same. "You're not the same," she said. "You're quieter, but not the tense quiet. The other one." He did not ask her to explain the distinction. He thought he understood it. She did not press him. She had never pressed him on things he was not ready to discuss, which was one of the reasons he had been able to maintain a relationship with her that was honest within its limitations. She changed the subject to the biography. He asked questions. The call ended after another 20 minutes, pleasantly, in the way of people who know how to spend time with each other without requiring it to be more than it is. After the call, he sat in his office in the quiet of a Sunday evening and thought, without particular intensity, about the parking lot at Donati's. He thought about the box the woman had been carrying and the way she had stood there with it for those seconds after the other man left, and had then made her feet move toward the kitchen door, one step at a time, as though she were having to remind each leg what it was for. He thought about the sentence the man had said, "No one is going to save you." He thought about the specific kind of confidence required to say something like that. The confidence of someone who has run the calculation so many times, with the same result each time, that the result has become invisible, has become simply the nature of things. He had been the variable the calculation had not accounted for. He did not think of this with pride. Pride would have overstated the cost, which had been minimal, and understated the agency of the woman herself, which was the part of the situation he found more interesting the more he thought about it. He had removed an obstacle. The walking had been hers. The years of it, the 14 months of legal proceedings and the packed bag and the borrowed car and the 400 miles and the lock on her own door in a city she had chosen, all of that had been hers, and none of it had required him or anyone like him. What had required intervention was not the problem of her survival or her capacity. Those had already been demonstrated, repeatedly, under conditions that had been designed specifically to prevent the demonstration. What had required intervention was simpler. A man with no legitimate claim on her continued to operate on the assumption that no one would notice or care. The assumption had been incorrect. Enzo had noticed. Enzo had cared, or something functionally equivalent to caring. He was not always precise about the language for his interior states, which was a limitation he had made some peace with. He had been present, and he had been paying attention, and he had the means to do something. And doing something was what you did when those three conditions were simultaneously true. Gordon knocked on the office door one afternoon, in the week after the Sunday call. He came in and stood near the desk, with the particular quality of someone who has an update that may or may not warrant formal mention. "Voss," he said, "nothing in the 6 weeks since the meeting. Schedule is normal, no contact through any channel we can access." "All right," Enzo said. "You want us to maintain the monitoring?" Enzo thought about this for a moment. "Another 2 weeks. If there's still nothing, close it." Gordon nodded. He turned toward the door. "The woman," Enzo said. Gordon stopped. "Calloway. I don't want her monitored. She is not part of this, and I don't want her treated as though she is." Gordon turned back enough to indicate he had heard this. Understood. He left. Enzo returned to his papers. The instruction felt important to him, and he examined it briefly before setting it aside. He had not involved himself in her situation in order to create a different kind of surveillance, a more benevolent one that she had also not chosen and also did not know about. What she had was her own life, and his involvement in it was finished, and whatever she built from this point was built without his observation. That was correct. He was clear that it was correct. He had been thinking, in the weeks since the parking lot, about the specific anatomy of the thing Marcus Voss had done to her over the years. He had thought about it not with emotional investment, but with the analytical attention he brought to most things, because it was the kind of situation that bore examining if you wanted to understand it, rather than simply react to it. He understood control in the abstract. He operated in a world where control was the central currency, and the methods of establishing it were various and not always visible. He understood the use of consistency over time as a means of shaping another person's belief about themselves. He understood how a sufficiently precise and patient application of doubt could function as a tool. These things were not foreign to him in the abstract. What struck him, examined closely, was the specific efficiency of the method Marcus had used. No evidence, No visible mechanism. No moment where an outside observer could have pointed and said, "There, that is the thing being done." It had operated entirely in the interior of a person, in the space between what was said and what was concluded from the saying, in the accumulated weight of small things over time. It was almost perfectly designed to be invisible from the outside and inescapable from the inside. Almost perfectly designed. Not entirely. Nothing designed by one person for use against another is perfect, because the person it is used against is not a fixed object. She had left. 3 times, before the 4th time held. She had found Patricia Holt. She had driven 400 miles. She had documented everything. She had kept her job and transferred it, and taken an apartment, and maintained a life in a city he did not control, under a name he had not given her, for 14 months. She had been doing this long before he was anywhere near that parking lot. He was, when he thought about it clearly, a footnote in a story that was already well underway. The story was hers. The footnote was necessary. He did not minimize the function of the footnote, but it was still a footnote. He found this, on reflection, clarifying. He had not saved anyone. He had read a situation correctly and acted on the reading, at minimal cost to himself, in the direction of a correct outcome. That was the kind of thing a person should do when the conditions for it existed. It did not require a larger narrative. It did not require him to think of himself differently than he had before. It was simply the correct action taken in the available moment. He returned to his work. On Crane Street, 4 miles from where he sat, Nadia Calloway was in her kitchen with the window open and the radio on low, and she was cooking a meal she had not made in 6 years. She had not made it because cooking it properly required time and ease and presence, the willingness to be fully in your own body in your own space for an uninterrupted hour, and those things had not been available to her for a very long time. The marriage had not permitted them. The years immediately after the marriage had not permitted them either, for different reasons. But she had come home from work that evening and had stood in front of her open refrigerator and thought, "I want to cook that thing." And she had bought what she needed on the way home, and she was cooking it now, and the smell of it filled her apartment in a way that was deeply, specifically, almost embarrassingly moving to her, because the smell was the smell of the version of herself that had existed before, the version that had cooked and enjoyed it, and had not yet known what the years ahead would contain. That version was not gone. She was discovering this. She had thought, for a long time, that she had become something else entirely, some smaller and more frightened arrangement of the original person having been lost or given away or taken. But the version that cooked was still there. She was finding other things too. The version that sang along to the radio without checking whether she was allowed to. The version that called Carol and laughed properly, from the stomach, without monitoring the laugh for how it might land. The version that bought herself flowers at the farmer's market on Saturday morning, because she liked them, and there was no one to say the expense was foolish. She was not reclaiming a lost self. She did not think of it in those terms, which felt too dramatic for what was actually happening. What was actually happening was simpler. She was finding out, incrementally, through direct experiment, that more of her remained than she had believed, that the years had not removed these things. They had only placed them somewhere she could not access from inside the conditions she had been living inside. She was outside those conditions now. She had put herself outside them. That was the fact she returned to, when she needed to return to something. She plated the meal and carried it to the kitchen table and sat down at it properly, with a chair pulled fully from the table and the window visible to her left, and the room around her, her room, her apartment, her name on the lease. She ate without hurrying. The food was good. She had always been a good cook when she was given the room to be one. After dinner, she washed her dishes and put them away and made a cup of tea, and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the room, the ordinary, plain, chosen room, and felt something that she did not attempt to name, because naming it felt like it might disturb it. She let it sit. She went to the sofa and opened her book. Outside, the city continued in the way it always continued, indifferent, ongoing, full of the anonymous weight of other people's lives and other people's private arithmetic. Somewhere in it, Marcus Voss was living with a calculation that had not changed in 12 weeks, and was not going to change, and whether he had arrived at something like understanding, or simply at the practical decision that the math did not favor continuation, she would never know, and she did not need to know. The silence was real. The silence was hers. That was sufficient. Somewhere else in the city, A man she would never meet was sitting in a plain office, or going home from one, having done what the day required of him, and the day had required nothing of him in her direction, and had not for some time. She was not part of his calculations. She had never been part of them in the way that a person is part of calculations made about them. She had been a situation assessed and addressed. Now she was the absence of a situation. The file was closed. She was not a file. She was a woman sitting on a sofa in a fourth-floor apartment on Crane Street, reading a library book with a cup of tea at her elbow, with the city coming in through the window she had left open a few inches, and she was not being watched by anyone. That was not a small thing. She read until her eyes told her they were done. She set the book aside, checked the time, just past 10, ordinary, and took her tea to the sink and rinsed it, and turned off the lights in the kitchen and the front room, and went to her bedroom and closed the door. She fell asleep in her own apartment, in her own name, with the city outside continuing on its own terms and nobody anywhere who had an account of her location except the people she had told. She had built that. The specific structure of it, the distance, the apartment, the job, the locked drawer with the documented log, the library on Saturdays, the window table at Harbor Coffee. She had built all of it herself, piece by piece, from whatever had been available to her at each stage, which had not always been enough, and which she had used anyway. "Nobody will save you," a man had said in a parking lot, in the voice of certainty, in the voice of someone who has always found this to be true and sees no reason to revise the finding. He had been right that nobody was going to save her. Saving was not what had happened. Saving would have required a situation in which she was incapable of moving on her own, and she was not incapable. She had been moving on her own for 3 years before any of this. She had been fighting her own way out of something that had been specifically designed to prevent the fighting, and she had fought her way out of it, slowly and imperfectly, and at enormous cost, and she had built something from what remained afterward. What had happened in the parking lot and in the weeks following it was not salvation. It was the removal of an ongoing interference. It was the correction of a situation that should not have been permitted to continue. It was, at most, the world briefly operating the way it was supposed to operate, the way that most people, most of the time, can trust it to operate, without having to find their own Enzo Carrera, or arrange their own Dennis Hale, or hope that the right person happened to be standing in the right parking lot at the right moment. She should not have needed any of that. The structures that existed should have been sufficient. They had not been. That was a failure of the structures, not of her. She had done what she could with what was available, and what was available had eventually, improbably, included a variable that the original calculation had not accounted for. She had used the margin. That was what she had always done. You used the margin that existed, whatever its size, and you kept going, and you found out eventually what was still there. She was still there. The city came in through the open window, the sound of it, ordinary and continuous, and she slept. In the morning she woke before the alarm, which she had been doing more often in recent weeks. She lay in the bed in the gray early light and listened to the building, the pipes, a door somewhere on a lower floor, the first sounds of traffic building on the street below, and she felt the particular quality of a morning that belonged to no one but herself. No reading of the room before she opened her eyes, no calibration of the air for what the day might require of her in the way of management. Just morning. Just the ordinary, extraordinary fact of it. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window with it, the same way she had stood there on the morning of the call that had led to this day, except that the phone was face up on the counter, and she was not waiting for it to ring. She watched the street below gather itself into the shape of a Tuesday. The woman with the dog she saw most mornings, the man in the yellow jacket who cycled past at the same time every day, and whom she had never seen at any other time, and had privately concluded lived somewhere in between 2 points that happened to take him down Crane Street each morning. A group of 3 people walking together. Too much laughter for this hour, which she found cheering rather than irritating. She went to Harbor Coffee. She took the table by the window. Bet had the tea ready before she reached the counter. They talked for 4 minutes about the book Bet had finished over the weekend, which she had decided was ultimately unsatisfying but had been impossible to stop reading, a combination she found both annoying and characteristic of the genre. Nadia said she knew the feeling. She took her tea to the table and sat facing the room, and watched the morning come in through the door, in the form of regular people carrying regular things, and she was present for all of it, simply and without effort. She had her work. She had the library on Saturdays. She had Carol on Sundays. She had a raised garden bed she was planning to put on the building's rooftop terrace in the spring, which required a conversation with the building manager that she had been putting off, because she did not yet know whether she had the kind of relationship with the building manager that permitted requests. But she was going to find out! She had the river walk in the late afternoon. She had the shortbread at Harbor Coffee on the mornings she allowed herself it, which was more mornings than it used to be. She had her name, the one she was born with, the one she had reclaimed, the one that was hers without qualification, and had always been hers, and which she was learning, slowly and in earnest, to inhabit again. She finished her tea. She thanked Bet. She walked to the bus stop and got on when the bus arrived and took the window seat and watched her city move past the glass. And she went to work, and she was good at it, and she came home in the evening and cooked dinner and read and went to sleep. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was, after everything, exactly what it was supposed to look like.